October 11th, 1876. Just after sunset. A man named Elias Renwick appeared at the edge of a remote survey camp somewhere east of the high ridges dividing the railroad territories from the dry basins of the American interior. At first, the men in camp did not recognize him. He came out of the valley on foot, moving slowly between the sagebrush and the gray stones, dragging one leg slightly behind the other. His coat was torn open at the shoulder. His beard was crusted with dust and frost. His right hand was wrapped in a strip of cloth so dark with dried blood it looked almost black in the fading light. He was supposed to have returned the day before yesterday. The men watched him cross the open ground. Nobody called out. There was something in the way he moved, not panic, not delirium, that made them stay where they were and wait. He walked past the cook fire, past the mules, past the instruments laid under canvas. He stopped at the main drafting table inside the survey tent, pulled a leather case from inside his coat, and placed it flat in front of the chief engineer. His hands were shaking badly enough that another man had to open the clasp. Inside was a folded sheet of thick drawing paper. When they spread it out under the lantern light, the room went quiet. Not the quiet of confusion, the quiet of recognition. The kind that arrives when something contradicts everything you expected to find, and the contradiction is too precise to dismiss. Renwick had been sent into a region the survey team called Empty Valley. A long, dry corridor between mountain walls where earlier maps disagreed with one another. Some showed a pass. Some showed nothing. One railroad sketch from the previous year marked the area with a single word, uncertain. For the companies financing the survey, uncertain land was not just a geographical problem. It was money trapped inside blank paper. A valley could become a shortcut. A dry basin could hide mineral claims. A pass through the right ridge could redirect an entire railroad line and decide which towns would live and which would vanish from the map. Renwick's job was straightforward. Cross the valley. Take measurements. Correct the map. He entered on October 7th with a mule, a field notebook, a compass, a pocket transit, a measuring chain, 2 canteens, and enough provisions for 4 days. He had done this kind of work before. He was in his late 30s, trained in practical surveying, known for careful sketches of difficult terrain. One surviving paymaster's note describes him as steady and methodical. He had been trusted with independent field work repeatedly and had never returned with anything that needed to be questioned. What he found inside Empty Valley questioned everything. The first day went normally. A partial note attributed to his field book describes the eastern slope as loose stone, gray soil, scattered brush, no water. A dry channel runs south by southwest. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would trouble an engineer. Nothing that would justify what came later. The second day is where the record begins to thin. The official summary says only that Renwick continued through the lower basin and found no practicable grade. Routine language. Bureaucratic language. But a draftsman named Thomas Bell later described seeing the field book before it was altered. According to Bell, Renwick's notes for the second day were far longer than the summary suggested. There were sketches of stone alignments, repeated measurements across the valley floor, and a phrase written and then underlined. Angles too consistent for wash lines. Renwick would have known what that meant better than anyone. A natural valley produces lines. Dry channels cut through sediment. Rock fractures create edges. Wind exposes ridges. From a distance, the human eye can impose order where there is none, and a trained surveyor's first instinct is to assume the natural explanation before reaching for anything else. The fact that Renwick underlined that phrase tells you he had already tried the natural explanation. And it hadn't fit. On the third day, something shifted. Renwick abandoned the planned route west. Instead of continuing to the ridge to mark rail grades, he turned toward the center of the valley. This was not a panicked detour. It was not a man getting lost. Based on the markings later visible in the final drawing, he took measurements from at least 3 positions across the basin floor, using elevation points along the valley walls to triangulate a central formation. That is the behavior of a surveyor verifying what he does not want to believe. Picture him out there on that third day. The light hard and flat against the basin. The mule gone or failing. His provisions running low. And in front of him, something that keeps measuring out the same way no matter which position he calculates from. Lines that connect. Distances that repeat. Circles that close around a center. He was cold. He was injured. We don't know when or how his hand was torn, only that it was. He had to know he would not make it back to camp before dark. He stayed anyway. He kept measuring. Then his notes stop. Or rather, the surviving notes stop. The pages covering the final approach to the formation, the confirmation, if there was one, were missing from the version of the notebook later shown to the survey office. That is the first major anomaly. Pages are lost in field work. They tear, soak, burn, blow away. But missing pages become a different kind of problem when they disappear precisely where the discovery should have been documented. The absence here is not random. It covers exactly the hours between Renwick's suspicion and whatever he found at the center. The final drawing is proof that he found something. The drawing, as described by multiple witnesses, was not a sketch. It contained a scale bar. It contained directional bearings. It showed the surrounding ridges with enough accuracy that the chief engineer recognized the valley immediately. The central formation was rendered in plan view, top-down, technical, architectural. That matters. An artist imagines from the side. A surveyor records from above. Renwick was recording layout. At the formation center, a raised rectangular or oval platform, depending on which witness is quoted. Around it, 3 concentric rings or partial rings. Straight lines extending outward toward shallow channels, like spokes on a wheel partially buried in the ground. Along the outer arc, smaller rectangular outlines, wall bases, stone alignments, or foundations worn nearly flat by time. The entire arrangement was partially buried. Only low edges and stone ridges remained visible above the valley floor, as if the site had not been abandoned so much as slowly swallowed. At the bottom of the page, pressed so hard into the paper that the words left grooves in the surface beneath. Not natural. Do not publish without confirmation. Read those words the way they were written, by a man who understood the limits of field evidence, who knew what professional caution required, who had spent his career not overstating what he saw. He was not writing a legend. He was not writing in excitement or fear. He was writing the most careful version of an observation that had no careful version. Not natural. Within 2 days of Renwick's return, 2 men arrived at the survey camp. Their names are unclear in the surviving accounts. One appears to have been a route engineer connected to a railroad land interest. The other may have been attached to an acquisition office. They were not there to investigate ruins. They were there to evaluate Empty Valley for future routing, to determine whether the blank space on the map had any economic value worth pursuing. They examined Renwick's drawing behind a closed tent flap. One witness said voices were raised. Not arguing, sharper than that. The kind of voices that emerge when the conversation has moved past disagreement into something else. Another man in camp said the chief engineer came out of the tent and told them, flatly, that the drawing was not to be discussed until the report was settled. Renwick, still feverish, still weak, asked for his field book. He was told it had been placed with the official papers. He never got it back. From that point forward, the language around the case changed. This is how institutional erasure often works. Not through dramatic destruction, rarely through anything as obvious as a burning. More often through vocabulary. A discovery becomes an irregularity. A witness becomes unreliable. A missing page becomes a clerical issue. A place with memory becomes empty land again, because the word empty is so much more useful to the people writing the report. Renwick was no longer called careful. He was called unwell. The drawing was no longer described as a survey artifact. It became an unconfirmed observation. And then it disappeared. The official report filed later that year was the clean version. The useful version. Empty valley. Barren terrain. No reliable water. No viable settlement value. No structures of significance. Recommendation. No further survey until economic conditions changed. That recommendation had consequences. It meant no official team returned with urgency. It meant the drawing could be treated as unresolved indefinitely. It meant the valley could be bypassed on paper while whatever Renwick documented remained unverified and unavailable for any outside evaluation. But there is one detail that suggests someone did not fully discard the drawing. A regional map produced several years later quietly altered one feature in Empty Valley. A dry wash that earlier maps showed running in a rough curve was redrawn with a sharper bend near the basin center. A minor correction, easily missed. But the corrected bend aligns precisely with where witnesses placed Renwick's central formation on the drawing. The published maps did not include the drawing, but they absorbed part of its geography. That is the second major anomaly. And it is the most telling one. Because it means whoever revised that map had access to Renwick's information. They used it. They just made sure his name was nowhere near it. If Renwick was wrong, why use his data? If he was right, why remove the discovery? There is one more detail the official record preferred to leave unexamined. Empty Valley may not have been the valley's first name. A fragment in a supply ledger references a location that sounds like Hollow Stone Basin, though the handwriting is uncertain. A later recollection mentions a guide using a name translated loosely as the place that answers, which could refer to echo behavior in the valley, or to something older and harder to translate into English without losing the meaning entirely. A Paiute guide, unnamed in the records, allegedly refused to enter the lower valley and told one of the survey men that the floor was old ground and should not be crossed without reason. Old ground. Not sacred ground. Not dangerous ground. Old ground. The kind of description that comes from a people who had been traveling a landscape long enough to know what it remembered. Now consider those details together. The mule driver who said sound carried strangely from the basin at night. The guide's refusal. The possible name. The geometry Renwick measured. None of it proves anything by itself. But collectively, it forms the outline of a place that was never, to the people who knew it longest, empty at all. It was only empty to the systems that needed it to be. What happened to Renwick afterward is the quietest part of the story, and in some ways the most damning. He did not die dramatically. He did not vanish into the desert. He simply stopped mattering. A payroll record months later places him in a minor drafting position, copying other men's surveys onto clean paper. After that, his name fades from the professional record entirely. One account claims he returned east and never spoke publicly about the valley. Another says he attempted to petition for the drawing's return and was refused without explanation. A third says he carried a version reproduced from memory for years and destroyed it himself near the end of his life. None of those endings can be proven. But they all preserve the same truth. Renwick was separated from his own discovery. A man who had spent his career being trusted with difficult terrain was quietly set aside the moment he documented something inconvenient. His reliability was not questioned until it needed to be questioned. His judgment was not doubted until his judgment produced something no one wanted on the record. That pattern, the surveyor who sees too much and then simply disappears from meaningful work, is not unique to this case. It appears across the 19th century frontier, wherever a trained observer documented something that complicated the economic story being built around the land. The pattern itself is part of the evidence. Skeptics have a reasonable case, and it deserves a fair hearing. Exhaustion and dehydration can distort perception. Erosion patterns can mimic geometric structure. The missing notebook pages may have been lost to weather, not intent. The drawing may have been withheld not to suppress a discovery, but because responsible engineers do not publish unconfirmed observations. Later map revisions often incorporated multiple sources, and the corrected wash may have had nothing to do with Renwick. All of that is possible. But it does not settle the core problem. Reasonable doubt explains why the drawing might have been questioned. It does not explain why it vanished completely. It does not explain why a cartographic correction aligns with precisely the location Renwick documented. It does not explain why his professional reputation was revised only after he returned with something disruptive. And it does not explain why the report classified the valley with such finality when the mission's most critical pages were gone. A drawing that proved nothing would have been filed as an error and forgotten. A drawing that proved something dangerous was removed before anyone outside that tent could evaluate it. Those are different acts. And only one of them requires an explanation. The implications reach further than one missing document. The American interior in 1876 was not empty. It was crossed by indigenous trails, Old Spanish and Mexican traces, hunting routes, and abandoned settlements whose age no one in the survey parties had been trained to estimate. Surveyors moved ahead of settlement with fragile confidence and enormous authority. What they wrote down became real. What they omitted ceased to exist in the economic language of the time. A site with evidence of prior occupation was not just an archaeological curiosity. It was a complication. If the valley had been used, shaped, or structured by people who had been there before the surveys, then the land was not what the companies needed it to be. The story of empty land awaiting discovery, the story that justified every claim filed and every route drawn, required the land to have no memory. Renwick's drawing gave it memory. And that may be the most precise explanation for what happened inside that closed tent. The drawing was not suppressed because the men who saw it thought he was wrong. It was suppressed because they understood he might be right. Here is what remains. The return in October 1876. The injured surveyor at the table. The folded drawing and the room going quiet. The words pressed hard enough to scar the paper. The missing notebook pages. The closed meeting. The report that said too little. The map that changed without admitting why. The man who disappeared into minor work and never spoke publicly again. Each fragment by itself can be explained away. Together, they describe a shape. Not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, not a villainous plan executed in secret. Something more ordinary and more troubling. A system that encountered evidence it could not use, and disposed of it efficiently, and moved on, and was never asked to account for what it had done. Somewhere beyond the published routes, past the corrected wash and the unnamed basin, Empty Valley sits as it was left in the record, blank, dry, impractical, empty. But Renwick was there. He measured it. He pressed those words into the paper hard enough that the surface beneath held the impression even after the ink was gone. Not natural. 2 words from a man who spent his life knowing the difference. And one question that still cuts through the dust of 1876. What did Elias Renwick draw in that valley? And who decided that the rest of us were never supposed to find out?